This is Biomechanics Module 4, the last one, and we're going to talk about muscle characteristics. So there's several different pictures on here that get at the idea of muscle length and force generation. Here is just sort of a schematic of the sort of sequential nature of muscle, starting at the whole unit, getting smaller and smaller and smaller down to the fibril, which is this smallest unit, and then within a fibril are sarcomeres. And so a sarcomere is from a Z line to a Z line, right? Z line to Z line, and myosin proteins or filaments and actin proteins or filaments. And you can see that they overlap. The little projections off of myosin are the myosin heads. You'll see in this position, those myosin heads could engage with the actin, right? And that engagement is what allows these two proteins to slide relative to each other. So that's the sliding filament theory, and it's been around for a long time and still called a theory, but pretty much accepted as the way that muscles create tension. So if you just take one sarcomere and were to determine what is the length that gives us the best amount of tension, the highest amount of tension, and how does lengthening or shortening that sarcomere impact the ability to generate tension. This is the slide that shows that. So functional length is where all of the all the myosin heads are able to interact with the actin. So you'll see here that each myosin head is sort of covered by actin. That means that, in theory, 100% of those myosin heads could engage with an actin, and there could be a power stroke, which creates the tension in the muscle. And because 100% of them could engage, that gives us maximum tension. And so on this y-axis here is percent tension, 100%. That's our functional length of our muscle, as represented by the functional length of the sarcomere. All right, so that's here. That's max tension because of the length between the two Z bands. If we start to lengthen that muscle and increase the distance between the Z bands, we're going to start pulling the actin away from the myosin. So now we've only got about half of the myosin that are available to engage with an actin. So we're probably not going to generate as much force, right? Well, that's true. We're starting to decrease the amount of force or tension here to about 80% because we don't have the same, we don't have the numbers. If you continue to lengthen that muscle and separate those Z bands and pull actin away from myosin, now you're just barely able to engage any of the myosin with the actin, and you've got very low force production potential. So a longer muscle doesn't generate as much force just because there's not as many actin-myosin cross-bridge interactions. If we start the other way on what's called the ascending arm of the active tension curve, the same thing happens. If we shorten a muscle, the actin starts to overlap itself and slide over the myosin such that there are fewer cross-bridge potentials. Fewer actin-myosin interactions are possible. And so, again, we lose the ability to produce tension. And then here, way down at the start of this ascending limb of the active tension curve, now there's so much overlap that there's very little interaction possible, and we generate very little tension. So the length of the muscle is really important. And there's an optimal length or a functional length where we can generate maximum force. And there's low force potential when our muscle is really long, and there's low force potential when our muscle is really short. That's what this graph is telling us. I mentioned earlier in one of the other modules that we also generate tension in the muscle when we stretch it, when we lengthen it, because muscle doesn't just have the contractile proteins or the active components. It also has passive components. So a couple of the passive components are the tendons, or where it inserts into the bone. But there's connective tissue within and surrounding muscle as well that are in parallel with the active components. And so as we start to elongate a muscle, not only do we lose overlap and lose the ability to create active tension, but we start to gain passive tension. You think about that cigarette butt or that pool noodle. As we start to stretch it, tension grows and grows and grows. That's what's happening internally in a muscle. We start to generate tension after we reach a certain length of that muscle. This is really good as a protective device, a protective mechanism for muscle. If we get our muscle stretched to a point where it's at the end of its range of motion, if it keeps going, we're going to damage a muscle, we're going to damage a joint, we're going to have an avulsion fracture, something bad's going to happen. Because we're gaining passive tension at a pretty rapid rate here, exponential rate of tension development as the muscle gets longer, that's going to protect us from going too far. And so it's a protective mechanism that's really a valuable part of the muscle structure. If you put those two things together, our active tension curve and our passive tension curve, you end up with total tension. And so total tension will be a little bit greater as we start to lengthen the muscle, because we've got some active tension capacity and we're gaining a lot of passive tension capacity. So total tension curve looks like this. You'll notice that this is our optimal tension generating length in terms of active tension. We don't start generating passive tension until we are lengthened beyond that point. So what are the applications here that matter for us? We're going to assess muscle strength using manual muscle testing, and we want to position the joint so that the muscle is close to that optimal contractile position so that it can generate its maximum tension. That's usually in the mid-range for a muscle. We don't want to put the person or the muscle at a disadvantage, either really long or really short, so that it's doesn't have the capacity to generate tension. We want to test it at its power point. Okay, so that's one thing. We're also going to assess range of motion, and so we know that as we put somebody towards the end of their potential range of motion, we're also putting the muscles on tension, passive tension, and that could be one of their limiters of motion. And it's a decision point in our clinical thinking about is muscle contributing to a loss of normal range of motion in this particular person at this particular joint. And then there are some muscle length tests that we'll do. If you think about the hamstrings, for example, it's a really good example. We've got some tests that'll look at hamstring length, and that's really the distance between the origin insertion. We position the joint and the person in such a way that we maximize that distance by moving them further and further at their joint. And we can assess muscle length. So it's important to understand how passive tension impacts that, that measurement. Lastly, and hopefully this is something you've all seen before and it'll be a little bit of review, but it's important. There are different types of muscle contractions, and up till now I've been talking mostly about a concentric contraction. We're making the muscle shorter, we're creating more and more force, we're overcoming gravity. That's a concentric contraction. So let me back up. Isometric is the actin and the myosin are engaged. They're generating tension internally in the muscle, but there's no change in the muscle length because the motion is blocked for some reason, right? So we're not creating any motion at a joint, but the muscle that could create motion at that joint is active, it's contracting, it's not changing its length. So that's an isometric contraction. Concentric is when a muscle is, the actin and myosin are engaged, the muscle is creating tension, and that muscle shortens as that contraction continues. So that's a concentric contraction is a shortening contraction. An eccentric contraction is the opposite. It's a contraction where there's internal force being generated, but the muscle is lengthening. So those cross bridges are engaged, actin and myosin are engaged, but they're holding, they're breaking, they're allowing a little bit of lengthening, and they're re-engaging, breaking, re-engaging, breaking, re-engaging, and they're allowing that muscle to lengthen at the same time, continuing to keep tension in that muscle. And what's the application here? There's a lot of application in PT about with these different types of contractions, from the type of exercises we choose to understanding how forces are impacting the person during motions. When we get into gait and gait analysis, there's a lot of eccentric, concentric interactions as we walk, and we deal with both gravity and ground reaction forces. But basically, isometric contractions are typically used to provide joint or body stability. So we're contracting our muscles, but there's no motion, but the joint is being held in one position statically, and that's a position of stability. So if you think of a plank exercise, you're using a whole lot of muscles, primarily your abdominals, but other muscles as well, to hold your trunk, hips, knees, ankles in one position, and those are all done isometrically. The muscles are not changing their length. So that's an example of an isometric contraction providing stability. Concentric contractions are used to do positive work, okay? Lifting something up, throwing something, accelerating an object, using a force to move something. That's all considered positive work, and generally those are done by concentric contractions. And then eccentric contractions are said to use to be doing negative work. Okay, so we're absorbing forces now. We're lowering an object. We're using those eccentric mechanisms to lower something to the ground, to land softly from a jump. We're decelerating our body as it's going towards the floor. So different functional uses from these muscles is a really important concept to understand, and we'll get more into that in the program in many places.